Today, we're counting down 10 Titan-sized engineering dreams that promised to change the world, but ended up as modern-day ghost towns. From towering skyscrapers to massive transit hubs, these are the monuments of ambition gone wrong. They prove that even a billion-dollar blueprint can't always survive a change in the tides. Starting with Number 1. The Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant Unit 5 and 6. The unfinished Units 5 and 6 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant do represent one of the largest abandoned projects ever created. Located adjacent to the operational reactors near Pripyat in northern Ukraine, these units were part of a major expansion plan intended to significantly increase the plant's output. Construction began in the early 80s, well before the disaster that would permanently alter the site's future. Chernobyl was designed as a multi-reactor complex. By the mid-1980s, 4 reactors were operational and Units 5 and 6 were already well underway. The design for these reactors followed the same RBMK-1000 model. Similar to the earlier units, massive concrete containment structures, turbine halls, and cooling systems were constructed simultaneously. By 1986, Unit 5 was reportedly more than 70% complete, and Unit 6 was not far behind. But on April 26, 1986, Reactor 4 exploded during a safety test, releasing radioactive material across much of Europe. Although Units 1, 2, and 3 continued operating for several years after the incident, the expansion reactors were never resumed. The structures of Units 5 and 6 were left exactly where the construction stopped. Inside, the unfinished turbine halls have massive machinery that was never installed or connected. Pipes, valves, and electrical systems are just partially assembled, and the concrete walls rise without any final sealing. In many areas, equipment is still wrapped or tagged from the original construction phase. There is little uncertainty about these units. They were never completed, never fueled, and never brought online. What makes this one especially significant is the scale to one of the world's most consequential industrial disasters. The unfinished reactors sit beside a site that once symbolized technological progress and later became synonymous with risk and failure. Today, Units 5 and 6 stand frozen as construction sites within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Cranes, buildings, and reactor housings remain where work stopped nearly 4 decades ago. They show how even the most complex projects can be instantly rendered obsolete by a single event. Their continued existence is a record of how ambition and catastrophe intersected, and it left behind one of the most striking abandoned industrial projects ever built. Number 2. The Tempelhof Airport. Located just south of Berlin city center, Tempelhof Airport began as a military parade ground in the 19th century before being adapted for aviation use in the early 20th. By the 1930s, it was selected by the Nazi government for massive expansion into what was intended to be the world's largest airport. Construction on the terminal began in 1936. Designed by architect Ernst Sagebill, the structure was conceived on an unprecedented scale. The terminal stretched more than 1.2 kilometers in a sweeping arc and incorporated hangars, offices, and facilities for passengers and an underground rail connection. At the time, it was among the largest buildings in the world by floor area. The project never was fully completed as originally envisioned due to the outbreak of World War II, but the airport became operational and played a major role in both military and civilian aviation. Tempelhof's most famous chapter came after the war during the Berlin airlift of 1948-49 when the Soviet Union blocked land access to West Berlin. Allied forces used Tempelhof as one of the primary airports to supply the city entirely by air. At its peak, aircraft were landing every few minutes, delivering food, fuel, and supplies. But despite this legacy, it faced growing challenges in the late 20th century. The airport's runways were relatively short by modern standards and couldn't easily accommodate larger jet aircraft. Meanwhile, newer airports like Tegel and Schönefeld offered more flexibility and capacity. The commercial flights at Tempelhof declined steadily, and in 2008, the airport was officially closed to all air traffic, and that marked the end of more than 80 years of continuous aviation use. The former airfield itself was eventually opened to the public as Tempelhofer Field, a vast urban park where runways became paths for walking, cycling, and recreation. And while this reuse did bring new life to an open space, the core infrastructure, the terminal, the control facilities, and hangars, all remained largely disconnected from their original purpose. The airport was built to dominate air travel in an earlier era, and it did so successfully for decades. But its abandonment shows how infrastructure designed for one scale and technology can become incompatible with later systems. It's a clear case where an essential piece of transportation infrastructure became obsolete while still structurally intact, and it left behind a massively built environment searching for a new role.
Number 3. The Salton Sea Recreation Infrastructure. Located in Southern California's Imperial and Coachella Valleys, the Salton Sea itself was created accidentally in 1905 when floodwaters from the Colorado River breached irrigation canals and filled a low-lying basin. Over time, the lake became a focal point for ambitious tourism and recreation development. By the 1950s and 60s, state and local authorities promoted the Salton Sea as a major inland resort destination. Marinas, yacht clubs, hotels, trailer parks, boat ramps, roads, they were all built along the shoreline, and communities like Salton City, Bombay Beach, and North Shore were developed with the expectation that the lake would become a permanent recreational asset. And then the collapse came gradually but decisively. The Salton Sea has no natural outlet, and over time, agricultural runoff increased the salinity of it. Fish populations began to die off, algal blooms worsened, and the water quality deteriorated. As evaporation continued and water inflow decreased, the salinity levels surpassed those of the ocean. By the late 1970s and early 80s, massive fish die-offs and foul odors drove everybody away. The tourism declined sharply. Marinas became unstable as the water levels dropped and shorelines receded. Boats were stranded on dry land and yacht clubs and hotels closed. Infrastructure built for thriving waterfront communities were left behind, often within a sight of a shrinking, polluted lake. And while small populations remain in some communities, the original infrastructure is never recovered. Various restoration plans have been proposed by state and federal authorities, but implementation has been slow and limited in scope. While the environmental mitigation projects exist, they don't really restore the Salton Sea to its former recreational role. The infrastructure built for tourism is functionally obsolete. Today, the abandoned marinas and shoreline developments form one of the most extensive examples of a failed recreational infrastructure in the U.S. It's a physical record of how quickly a natural system can just undermine large human-built projects, leaving behind entire communities and facilities without any viable purpose.
Number 4. The PR Complex. Located along the Baltic Sea on Germany's Rügen Island, PRA was conceived in the late 1930s as part of the Nazi regime's Strength Through Joy program, which aimed to provide leisure facilities for German workers on an unprecedented scale. Construction began in 1936, and the plan was to create a single continuous seaside resort capable of accommodating up to 20,000 people at once. Pora consisted of 8 identical concrete blocks arranged in straight lines stretching about 4.5 kilometers along the coast. Each block was designed to be 6 stories high with thousands of small, standardized rooms facing the sea. The rooms were intentionally minimal, which shows the project's mass accommodation philosophy rather than luxury. Shared dining halls, theaters, and recreational facilities were planned to serve this enormous population. By the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the main structural shell of the buildings were largely complete, but the interiors were unfinished. Construction, of course, was halted as resources and labor were redirected toward the war effort. The resort was never used for its intended civilian purpose, and, unlike many abandoned projects, Pora was not destroyed. It simply stopped mid-development, leaving behind kilometers of solid concrete structure. After the war, it fell under Soviet control and later became part of East Germany, and large sections remained unused during this period. When East Germany collapsed in 1990, the military use ended and Pora was largely abandoned again. For decades after reunification, it stood mostly empty. The sheer size of the structures made redevelopment difficult. Weather exposure caused deterioration, though the concrete shells remained structurally sound. There has been a bit of uncertainty over its identity. Is it an abandoned resort, or a military relic, or a redevelopment site? Yet in recent years, this complex has been converted into museums, apartments, hotels, and youth hostels. However, this redevelopment has been partial and uneven. So it does qualify as an abandoned infrastructure project, not because it vanished, but because it never fulfilled its original function. It goes to show you how infrastructure can survive physically while failing functionally. And it also shows that political ambition and architectural scale don't just guarantee usefulness or even longevity.
Number 5. The Cincinnati Subway. Planned in the early 20th century, the Cincinnati Subway was intended to provide a rapid transit system for a growing industrial city. Construction began in 1920, and unlike many speculative projects, portions were actually built before the work stopped permanently. At the time, Cincinnati faced increasing traffic congestion and was losing residents to expanding suburbs. City leaders proposed an underground subway loop beneath the city to connect major neighborhoods. Funding was approved by voters, and excavation began along what is now Central Parkway. By the mid-1920s, kilometers of tunnels have been completed, along with stations, platforms, and structural supports. The tunnels were fully engineered with concrete linings, drainage systems, and even ventilation. Construction stopped in 1927. Multiple factors contributed to the abandonment. Costs rose beyond initial estimates, and federal funding support was limited. Most critically, though, the rapid rise of automobile ownership reduced the perceived demand for this urban rail, and the onset of the Great Depression soon after eliminated any realistic chance of resuming work. All that infrastructure is still remaining beneath the city today. The tunnels are structurally sound in many areas. They've been periodically inspected, and some sections have been used for utility conduits or fiber optic cables. But the transportation system itself has never operated. Unlike proposals canceled before construction, the Cincinnati subway reached an advanced physical state and then just stopped. Entire underground spaces are hidden beneath everyday city life, invisible to most residents. It is a very clear example of an abandoned infrastructure project that still physically exists at scale. It was engineered, funded, and built to function, yet never served its intended purpose. Its presence beneath the city shows how long-term decisions like this can be rendered obsolete by shifts in economy, technology, and even public behavior.
Number 6. The Helen International Airport. The Helen International Airport was once the primary airport serving Athens and one of the most important hubs in southeastern Europe. It's located along the southeastern coast of the Athens metropolitan area. The airport operated from 1938 until its closure in 2001. The abandonment wasn't caused by any technical failure or disaster, but by a decision to replace it with a newer facility farther from the city. For decades, it handled nearly all international and domestic air traffic into Greece. It expanded gradually after World War II with multiple terminals added over time, and it became increasingly congested as air travel grew in the late 20th century. The noise concerns and safety considerations also became a bit more prominent as surrounding neighborhoods grew denser. In the 1990s, the authorities there decided to build a new airport, Athens International Airport at Spada, further inland with more room for long-term expansion. When the new airport opened in 2001, all commercial passenger flights were transferred and Helen was officially closed. Unlike airports that gradually declined, this one ceased regular operations almost overnight. Following its closure, huge portions of the airport were unused. Runways, taxiways, hangars, terminals, and the control facilities remained intact but inactive. And after the Olympics, the site again fell largely into disuse. It was briefly reused during the 2004 Athens Olympic Games, serving as venues or support spaces, but that was temporary.
There was a long-running debate and uncertainty about the site's future. Various redevelopment plans were proposed over the years, like parks, housing, tourism, and commercial projects, and legal disputes, financial constraints, and political changes delayed the implementation for more than a decade. And while redevelopment efforts have advanced in recent years, much of the original airport infrastructure is unused and has sat there for a long time, firmly qualifying it as an abandoned project for much of the early 21st century. For many years after closure, it was a visible reminder of how quickly infrastructure loses its relevance. Entire runways, terminals, and support systems remain intact but unused, forming a massive abandoned zone in the heart of a major European capital. It shows how strategic decisions, rather than collapse or neglect, can still result in large-scale abandonment.
Number 7. Baikonur-Buran Assembly and Launch Infrastructure. Developed by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the BAME Assembly and Launch Infrastructure, the Buran program, was intended as a reusable space shuttle system comparable in purpose to the United States Space Shuttle. To support it, an enormous network of highly specialized infrastructure was built at Baikonur, much of which is now abandoned. Construction of these related facilities began in the late 70s. This included a massive assembly building, launch pad, fuel system, and transport infrastructure. One of the most interesting structures was the MC-112 Assembly Hall, a huge hangar built to house multiple orbiters and rockets simultaneously. But the Buran shuttle flew only once in 1988, when that uncrewed orbital mission was technically successful, but geopolitical and economic conditions rapidly changed. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in '91, funding for the program disappeared. The Buran project was officially canceled in 1993. After this cancellation, the facilities were largely abandoned, maintenance stopped, security deteriorated, and exposure to the harsh environment accelerated decay. In 2002, the roof of one of the main assembly buildings collapsed, destroying the only completed Buran orbiter and several energy rockets. There is limited uncertainty regarding the abandonment itself, though access to detailed records is restricted. But what is clear is the infrastructure was never repurposed at scale. While it remains an active cosmodrome for other programs, the Buran-specific facilities are functionally obsolete. It was built for a real system that briefly flew and then vanished due to political collapse rather than any technical failure. Today, the structures are reminders of how rapidly large, purpose-built infrastructure can lose its relevance. They're among the largest abandoned aerospace facilities ever constructed, and they represent a complete industrial ecosystem that was left behind when the system it supported ceased to exist.
Number 8. The Montreal Mirabel International Airport. Located about 55 kilometers northwest of downtown Montreal, the Montreal Mirabel International Airport was conceived in the 1960s as a long-term solution to anticipated growth in international air travel. Canadian authorities believed that Montreal would become one of the busiest aviation hubs in North America, potentially rivaling New York and Chicago. Construction began in the early 70s, and the airport officially opened in 1975. It was designed on an enormous scale. The original plan had 6 runways and a terminal capable of handling more than 50 million people per year. To accommodate future expansion, the Canadian government expropriated about 200,000 acres of land, displacing several rural communities, and only a fraction of that land was ever used. From the beginning, it faced structural challenges unrelated to any engineering quality. The distance from Montreal made ground access inconvenient, and plans for a high-speed direct rail link were never realized. Airlines were reluctant to split operations between Mirabel and the older Dorval Airport, now Montreal Trudeau International, which remained closer to the city and better connected. Throughout the late 1970s and 80s, passenger numbers fell way below projections. Travelers frequently complained about long transfer times between domestic and international, which was often split between the two airports. Airlines gradually reduced their service there, and by the early 1990s, Mirabel had lost much of its traffic. In 2004, all scheduled passenger flights were officially moved back to Montreal-Trudeau. Mirabel's terminal was closed to passenger service, effectively ending its role as a commercial airport less than 30 years after opening. But physically, the terminal building remains largely intact. The check-in halls, baggage systems, and boarding areas stood unused. Large parking areas and access roads fell into disuse, and in the later years, portions of the terminal were demolished due to maintenance costs and safety concerns. But there's little uncertainty about its status. The abandonment as a passenger airport is fully documented, and the failure wasn't technical but strategic. Overestimated growth, poor connectivity, and airline resistance undermined a project built on optimistic assumptions. Its scale is impressive, but its emptiness defines its legacy.
Number 9. The Ryugyong Hotel. Located in the center of Pyongyang in North Korea, the Ryugyong Hotel was conceived as a landmark hotel and intended to showcase national ambition during the late Cold War period. Construction began in 1987. It was designed to rise about 330 meters, making it one of the tallest hotels ever planned. Now, the design of it is pretty unmistakable. It's a large triangular base with 3 wings that taper upwards, converging into a step pyramid-like peak. If completed as originally intended, the hotel would have contained more than 3,000 rooms along with restaurants, observation decks, and rotating dining spaces at the top. Construction progressed rapidly in the early years, with reinforced concrete shell reaching a full height by the early 90s. However, in 1992, work abruptly stopped. North Korea was entering a period of severe economic hardship following the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been a key source of financial support. Resources were redirected to more immediate priorities, and the unfinished building was left without exterior cladding, windows, or even interior systems. For more than a decade, it just stood there as an exposed concrete skeleton. During this period, it was widely described as one of the tallest unoccupied buildings in the world. There is limited publicly verifiable information about the internal condition of the structure during this time, but outside access has always been restricted, so it makes independent assessment pretty difficult. In the late 2000s, external work resumed in a limited way. The building was clad with glass panels, which changed its appearance significantly. Large LED lighting displays were added to the exterior, allowing the structure to be illuminated at night. But despite these cosmetic changes, there's no reliable evidence that the interior was ever completed or the hotel ever became operational. This hotel shows how political ambition, economic reality, and technical challenge will collide in large infrastructure projects. It was structurally completed but operationally unrealized, leaving behind a massive vertical shell that still dominates the surroundings. It is a rare example of a megastructure that reached full height yet never entered any use. It's one of the world's most recognizable, abandoned, and unfinished infrastructure projects anywhere, precisely because it was meant to symbolize completion and permanence, but instead became a long-standing symbol of interruption.
Number 10. The Ciudad Real Central Airport. Located in central Spain, the Ciudad Real Central Airport, about 200 kilometers south of Madrid, was conceived in the early 2000s during a period of rapid economic expansion. The project was promoted as a private alternative to Madrid's congested airports. The location was chosen with the idea that high-speed rail links would make it easy for passengers to travel between Madrid and Ciudad, allowing the airport to function like a long-distance hub for central Spain. Construction started in 2005, and the airport officially opened in 2008. It was built to an international standard and featured a runway about 4,100 meters long, which meant it was capable of handling the largest commercial aircraft like the Airbus A380. The terminal was designed to process millions of people each year, includes modern security systems, jet bridges, cargo facilities, and huge parking areas. On paper, the airport had the physical capacity to compete with major European hubs, but despite all this, the airport struggled almost immediately. Passenger demand never materialized at the levels projected. Several airlines briefly operated routes here, including services to Barcelona and some seasonal leisure destinations, but traffic remained extremely low.
The planned high-speed rail connection, that was never completed as envisioned, leaving the airport poorly connected to major population centers. By 2012, the airport's operating company declared bankruptcy, and what remained was a fully constructed modern airport with no passengers, no airlines, and no clear economic purpose. Then the site became the symbol of Spain's post-2008 financial crisis and the risks associated with speculative infrastructure development. Physically, though, the airport is largely intact. The terminal buildings, the control tower, runways, and taxiways are still there, though weathering and lack of maintenance have taken a toll. There's been uncertainty over the airport's long-term future, and at various points proposals included converting the site into a cargo hub, an aircraft storage facility, or maybe a logistics center. The infrastructure itself met the international standards, but its failure was tied to overestimated demand, poor connectivity, and broader economic collapse rather than any technical shortcomings. Today, the airport's a near-complete piece of modern infrastructure without a matching economic ecosystem. Visually and structurally, it's impressive. Functionally, it's one of Europe's most famous examples of an abandoned infrastructure project created in anticipation of growth that never arrived.